There's a wanted poster circulating through every Gestapo office in France. The description is specific but incomplete. A woman, probably in her 30s, walks with a noticeable limp. She speaks fluent French, but something about her accent doesn't quite fit. She's been linked to dozens of sabotage operations, resistance networks, and intelligence breaches across the Vichy zone. The Gestapo calls her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. They've assigned their best hunters to find her. Klaus Barbie himself has made her capture a personal priority. And the woman they're hunting is reading their communications, already planning her next operation, moving through Lyon with a confidence that borders on reckless. Her name is Virginia Hall, and the country she's risking everything for rejected her years ago because of the very disability the Gestapo is now using to track her down. The irony isn't lost on her, but irony doesn't stop bullets or prevent torture chambers, and she knows both are waiting if she makes one mistake. Before the war, Virginia Hall wanted exactly what most ambitious young Americans wanted from government service: a career in the Foreign Service, postings abroad, meaningful diplomatic work. She had the education from Barnard College and graduate studies across Europe. She had the language skills, fluent in French, German, and Italian, with working knowledge of Russian. She had the drive, the kind of relentless ambition that doesn't accept limitations. What she didn't have after a hunting accident in Turkey in 1933 was her left leg below the knee. The accident was freak, preventable, the kind of moment that redefines everything without warning. A shotgun discharged while she was climbing a fence during a bird hunting trip. The wound became infected in ways that Turkish medical facilities at the time couldn't fully address. Doctors amputated to save her life, cutting below the knee and fitting her with a heavy wooden prosthetic. She returned to America with a prosthetic leg she nicknamed Cuthbert, with the kind of dark humor that would define her approach to obstacles, and a determination to continue pursuing the diplomatic career she'd been building across Europe for years. The State Department saw things differently. Her formal application for the Foreign Service was rejected with bureaucratic efficiency, or the reason given was simple and final. Her disability made her unsuitable for foreign service. No amount of skill or experience could override that single physical fact. The decision was policy, not personal, which somehow made it worse. So Virginia Hall, fluent in multiple languages, with years of experience living and working abroad, with contacts across European capitals, was told she had no place in American intelligence or diplomatic operations. It was a rejection that would push her towards something far more dangerous than anything the State Department could have offered, and far more important than any diplomatic posting she might have received. When America wouldn't take her, Britain did, and not out of charity but out of desperate need. The Special Operations Executive, Churchill's organization for sabotage and subversion in occupied Europe, didn't care about missing limbs or bureaucratic standards of physical fitness. They cared about results, about people who could operate independently in hostile territory, and about finding anyone crazy enough to volunteer for work that had a life expectancy measured in months. Hall spoke the languages, knew the culture, and had something most recruits lacked: nothing left to lose and everything to prove. In 1941, she was sent into Vichy France under cover as a journalist for the New York Post. The cover was thin but functional in ways that mattered. Journalists had legitimate reasons to ask questions, move around cities, meet people from different social circles. She settled in Lyon, a city that sat in the supposedly unoccupied zone controlled by the Vichy government, but crawling with German intelligence officers and French collaborators who understood that cooperation meant survival and profit. From a small apartment on Place Ollier, Hall began building what would become one of the most effective resistance networks in France. She coordinated safe houses for escaping Allied soldiers and downed airmen, creating routes that moved men from crash sites to Spain and eventually back to Britain. She organized sabotage operations against railways and communication lines, recruiting locals who had skills and motivation but no coordination. She gathered intelligence on German troop movements, Vichy collaboration, and industrial production that was feeding the Nazi war machine. And she did all of this while filing occasional newspaper stories to maintain her cover, meeting contacts in cafes like Café de la Paix, and moving through a city where one wrong word to the wrong person, one moment of inattention, meant torture in the basement of the Hotel Terminus and execution in a ditch outside the city. For months, it worked better than anyone had expected. Her network grew from a handful of trusted contacts to dozens of active resistance members across the region. Resistance cells that had been operating independently, sometimes working against each other, began coordinating through her. Sabotage operations increased in frequency and effectiveness, targeted precisely at the infrastructure the Germans needed most. But the Gestapo wasn't blind, and success draws attention. Odd patterns emerged in the intelligence reports coming out of Lyon. Too many successful escapes from the same region. Too many precisely targeted acts of sabotage hitting the exact points that would cause maximum disruption. Someone was organizing this, coordinating it, and that someone was very good at staying invisible. The Germans started dedicating serious resources to finding the source. In November 1942, Klaus Barbie arrived in Lyon with a mandate to crush the resistance networks that were making the region ungovernable. History would remember him as the Butcher of Lyon for the systematic torture and murder of resistance members, Jews, and anyone else he decided was an enemy. His methods were brutal and effective. His job was simple: find the people running the networks and destroy them completely. Make examples that would terrify others into submission. He started making arrests based on intelligence gathered from informants and intercepted communications. Members of Hall's network began disappearing from their homes in the middle of the night. Some broke under torture and gave up names, addresses, meeting locations. The net tightened with each arrest. Barbie's intelligence, pieced together from multiple broken prisoners, pointed to a woman, foreign, probably American or British, who walked with a noticeable limp. The Gestapo issued alerts to every checkpoint, every train station, every collaborator network across the region. Find the limping woman, she's the key to everything. Bring her in alive if possible. Dead if necessary, just find her. Hall knew the walls were closing because her sources inside the Vichy police were warning her that her description was circulating. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair darker, altered her clothing style to appear more working class. She changed the way she walked, forcing herself to disguise the limp, even though it caused severe pain in her stump and threw off her balance. She moved safe houses every few days, never staying in the same location long enough to establish a pattern. But she kept operating because stopping meant the networks would collapse and people depending on her would die. Then in November 1942, the situation collapsed entirely in ways no one had predicted. American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the first major Allied offensive in the region. In response, Die Hitlers ordered the invasion of the Vichy zone, turning all of France into occupied territory and eliminating the thin fiction of Vichy independence. German troops flooded into Lyon and other southern cities. Checkpoints multiplied overnight. The Gestapo intensified operations with new authority and resources. Hall had hours, maybe a day, to get out before the manhunt reached her door. There were no planes coming to extract her, no submarines waiting off the coast, no easy options that didn't involve enormous risk. Her only realistic option was Spain, officially neutral but unpredictable in how it treated refugees and escaped agents, and the only route that didn't require passing through dozens of German checkpoints was over the Pyrenees mountains on foot in the middle of winter. The Pyrenees crossing nearly killed her. And it wasn't the hypothetical danger of mountains in winter, but the specific, grinding reality of it. It wasn't just the cold that dropped below freezing at night, or the altitude that made breathing difficult. It wasn't just the risk of German patrols along the French side, or Spanish border guards on the other who might shoot first or hand her back to the Germans. It was Cuthbert, the prosthetic leg that the State Department had used to reject her as unsuitable for service, that the Gestapo was using to hunt her as their most wanted spy, became an instrument of torture on the mountain. Every step caused pain that radiated up from the stump. The wooden and metal prosthetic wasn't designed for climbing frozen slopes or navigating rocky terrain. The straps rubbed the stump raw, then bloody. She had to keep moving because stopping meant freezing to death, or being caught by patrols that swept the traditional crossing routes. The guide she'd hired kept pushing the pace, worried that snow would close the passes completely. Somewhere during that crossing, probably during a brief rest in a shepherd's hut, she sent a coded message back to SOE headquarters in London through a resistance contact who had a radio. The message was brief, understated in the way that defined her communication style. Cuthbert is being tiresome. The handler receiving the message in London, not knowing that Cuthbert was her prosthetic leg, not understanding the context, sent back what must have seemed like practical advice. If Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated. The response became legend among SOE operatives when the story circulated later. A perfect example of the communication gaps between field agents and handlers sitting safe in London offices. Hall reached Spain after several days in the mountains. Frostbitten, exhausted, her stump damaged badly enough that it would cause her pain for the rest of her life. Spanish authorities arrested her immediately as an illegal immigrant because Spain's neutrality meant enforcing border laws to maintain the appearance of not favoring either side. It took weeks of negotiation by British intelligence and careful diplomatic pressure to secure her release from a Spanish prison. She'd escaped the Gestapo's most intensive manhunt, but the war wasn't over, and neither was she. By 1944, the Americans finally wanted Virginia Hall, not because bureaucratic attitudes had changed, but because the situation was desperate enough that competence mattered more than conformity. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, needed experienced operatives for the coming invasion of France. Hall knew the territory, the networks, the tactics of resistance operations. She knew how to survive behind enemy lines because she'd already done it for years. But there was a significant problem that couldn't be ignored. The Gestapo still had her description circulating through every office in France. The limping American woman was still one of the most wanted Allied agents in occupied territory. Going back seemed suicidal in ways that even the OSS had to acknowledge. Hall went anyway, and this time under American authority and under a disguise so complete the Gestapo looked right past her in multiple encounters. She dyed her hair gray, filed down her teeth to change the shape of her face, and adopted the persona of an elderly peasant woman named Marcel Montaigne. She shuffled when she walked, exaggerating age and frailty to mask the limp that had become her identifying feature. In the weeks before D-Day, she was inserted into central France by British motor torpedo boat, landing on the Brittany coast and making her way to the region of Haute-Loire. Her mission was coordination and preparation for the invasion. The Allied landings would only succeed if German reinforcements couldn't reach Normandy quickly enough to push the invasion back into the sea. That meant sabotage, targeted and widespread, while timed perfectly to create maximum chaos across German logistics networks. Hall connected with local resistance groups, the Maquis, fighters who knew the land intimately but needed training, weapons, and leadership to be effective beyond small-scale harassment. She organized drops of weapons and explosives, coordinating with Allied aircraft flying night missions to deliver supplies. She trained fighters in demolition techniques and guerrilla tactics, turning farmers and shopkeepers into effective saboteurs. And when D-Day came on June 6, 1944, her networks executed their operations with precision that surprised even OSS handlers monitoring from London. The sabotage campaign Hall coordinated was devastatingly effective in ways that showed up in German military communications as chaos and confusion. Bridges exploded across central France, cutting major routes. Railway lines were cut in dozens of places simultaneously, forcing German trains onto predictable detour routes where they could be hit again. German communication lines went dead as telephone poles came down and junction boxes were destroyed. Trains carrying reinforcements derailed or were delayed for days by destroyed tracks and bridges. Roads became impassable as resistance fighters felled trees and destroyed culverts. The German military's ability to respond to the Normandy invasion was crippled across central France, and much of that operational chaos traced directly back to the networks Hall had built and the operations she coordinated from a farmhouse in Haute-Loire. The OSS recognized the impact immediately. After the liberation of France, the organization credited her work as pivotal to the success of the Allied advance inland from the beaches. Her sabotage networks had delayed German reinforcements by days at the moment when hours mattered. In September 1945, President Truman awarded Virginia Hall the Distinguished Service Cross, one of America's highest military honors, recognizing extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. She was the only civilian woman during World War II to receive it. The ceremony was private at her request. She didn't want publicity or recognition that would put her face in newspapers. She didn't want her identity known because she understood that intelligence work might continue and anonymity was survival. Even in recognition, she remained a ghost by choice and by professional necessity. Then the war ended, and everything changed in ways that revealed how little had actually changed in the bureaucracies she'd been fighting against since before the war. Virginia Hall joined the Central Intelligence Agency when it formed in 1947, one of the first women brought into the new organization. She had more field experience than almost anyone in the agency at that point. She'd run networks across hostile territory, coordinated complex sabotage operations, evaded capture by some of the best counterintelligence hunters Germany had deployed. She'd proven she could operate independently, make decisions under pressure, and deliver results that changed strategic outcomes. She should have been running operations, training new agents, shaping intelligence strategy for the Cold War that was already beginning. Instead, she was given a desk job analyzing intelligence reports in the agency's France division. The CIA, like the State Department before it, didn't quite know what to do with a woman in operational roles, especially one with a visible disability that violated unspoken assumptions about what field agents should look like. The same bureaucracy that had rejected her before the war now sidelined her during peace, putting her skills and experience into filing reports and analyzing intelligence that others had gathered. She spent years behind a desk, doing work that was important, but never came close to utilizing what she'd proven she could do under the worst conditions imaginable. Colleagues who worked with her later reported that she was quietly frustrated, or sometimes bitter about being overlooked for operational roles that went to men with a fraction of her experience. But she stayed because the work still mattered, and because leaving would have felt like giving the bureaucracy another victory. She worked through the 1950s and into the 1960s, watching younger officers with less experience move into roles she should have been considered for. And in 1966, she retired from the CIA without fanfare or public recognition, just a quiet end to a career that should have been celebrated. She moved to a farm in Barnesville, Maryland, with her husband, Paul Guillot, another former OSS officer who understood the life she'd lived. She lived quietly, raised goats, rarely spoke about the war, even to friends. When she died in 1982 at the age of 76, most of the world had no idea who she was or what she'd done. The obituaries were brief. Recognition came later, decades later, when historians started asking why so few people knew about the woman the Gestapo had called their most dangerous enemy. The story of Virginia Hall isn't just about bravery under fire or successful operations behind enemy lines, though it's certainly that. It's about the repeated, systematic rejection of someone who proved, over and over, that the standards used to judge her were wrong. The State Department rejected her because of a prosthetic leg, deciding she couldn't handle the physical demands of foreign service. The Gestapo hunted her because of that same prosthetic, using it as the primary identifier to track the most dangerous spy operating in France. And she escaped them, returned under their noses, and coordinated operations that directly contributed to Allied victory in ways that were documented and recognized. After proving all of that, the CIA put her behind a desk, because peacetime bureaucracies don't reward the same qualities that wartime operations do. The same attributes that made her invaluable during the war became invisible in peace. Risk-taking becomes recklessness. Independence becomes insubordination. Results matter less than fitting into organizational culture. And the question that her story leaves behind isn't just about what she accomplished, despite the obstacles placed in front of her. It's about how many others were dismissed, overlooked, or rejected, based on assumptions that had nothing to do with their actual capability. How many potential agents, operatives, analysts, and leaders were turned away because they didn't fit a predetermined image of what someone in that role should look like or how they should move through the world. Hall proved the assumptions wrong in the most definitive way possible, but the assumptions survived her. They outlasted the war, outlasted her career, and in many ways they're still making decisions in bureaucracies today. The limping lady who became the Gestapo's most wanted spy should have been a lesson about the cost of judging people on surface characteristics rather than capability. Instead, she became a footnote, recognized decades later, only when historians started asking why no one had heard of her, and why her story had been buried in classified files and forgotten. She deserved better than a desk job and a quiet retirement. And the systems that repeatedly failed to see her value, that rejected her, and then used her, and then discarded her, learned nothing from missing it.